All right. Well, the way we're going to work this session, as you see from the agenda, there's actually two parts to it. I'm just going to spend just a few moments doing some basic high-level reminders / update from a tax perspective, and then I'll turn it over to Beth, who will be talking about something that many of you have used and benefited from. Some of you may not have or may not be as familiar with it, and that's historic tax credits. And so she's going to talk a little bit about that, and we'll go from there. So as far as an update, what I wanted to talk about this year, or it's just a tax update for you folks, especially ones that are newer to our conference and maybe don't deal with these types of issues every day, is just a quick UBIT update. And there aren't a lot of differences, changes and updates on that as far as changes, but maybe it's more reminders and some of the things we're seeing as we help institutions prepare their 990s and 990Ts. And so the refresher part of this, as we all know, unrelated business income tax, where that comes about is if you're engaging in activities that meet 3 criteria, you're going to end up having potential UBIT issues, right? And those activities are going to be, or the criteria, the 3 questions are going to be, is it a business? Or basically, are you conducting it as if you're doing a business? You're doing the same types of things a business entity would do. Number 2 would be it's regularly carried on. And when you think about that, that seems like a simple question at first, but the reality is that regularly carried on is defined based on how a commercial enterprise would do that same activity. So it doesn't have to be a daily basis or anything like that to be considered regularly carried on. You're going to look at what does a corporate entity do, and are we doing it the same way? We're regularly carrying on that activity. And then the last bullet, of course, is that you simply ask, is it related to our exempt purpose? So those really, before you go any further in trying to understand unrelated business income and analyzing that on your campus, ask those 3 questions. And if all 3 of those questions don't apply, you can kind of move on. We're done with this. We don't have unrelated business income tax if any one of those 3 tests fail. Now, some of the changes that have occurred relatively recently is when you look at your campuses or your organizations and you're trying to decide what unrelated activities we may have, and let's say you start identifying a few. It used to be, this would be pre-January 1, 2018, I believe, tax years beginning before then. You basically had all these different unrelated activities. You put them all on a 990T. If you had an overall loss, you're good to go. Just like a corporate entity, you don't pay tax. You've got an NOL to carry forward the future years if you have income. That was the pre-January 1, 2018 tax year rules. What happened in that tax law that affects January 1, 2018 going forward is you now have to silo your activities. So if you have 3 unrelated activities that you've identified, maybe you've got some bookstore operations, some of you have a grocery store, you have some investment activities, you have different things that qualify as unrelated. Going forward, you have to track them separately. So now the 990T is a little more complicated. So if you generate a loss in one of those activities, you can't use that post January 1, 2018 loss to offset income from another activity. It can only be used to offset future income from that same activity. The losses that you had pre-January 1, 2018, you can still use to offset any of the losses for any of the activities. Now, I know with the accountant minds in here, you're thinking, how is that? Seems kind of convoluted. The way that shows up in the form is the Schedule A's for each individual activity. You'll notice now have their own NOLs that are being tracked for each activity. And you summarize all those things and roll them up to your main 990T. And when you get to the 990T, there's another line for NOL carry forwards. That NOL is the pre-January 1, 2018 NOLs. So that's how it flows through the process. Now, as far as looking at back to, again, what activities are going to cause this issue, even if you hit those 3 criteria that I mentioned before, if you recall, I said that means you may have some unrelated business activity. There are certain activities that are specifically excluded from being considered unrelated business income tax subject to it. And those are typically things like if you have volunteer labor that's doing substantially all the work, if you have, if it's done just for members' convenience, there's a list that the code provides. If you hit any of those, the whole activity is excluded. You don't have to worry about it. The other thing is actual income excluded. This one I'll spend a moment on because this does affect a lot of you when we do your tax returns. Even though, for example, interest and dividends aren't directly related to what you do, because it can't be considered directly related simply because it's providing income for it. So it's not directly related. You're regularly carrying it on. However, it is specifically excluded. Interest and dividends are not considered unrelated to your business activity. So you're not going to have to pay UBIT on them. You go down to a few other things. I'm going to touch on one here real quickly that affects a number of you, and that's rental income. Because this one on the surface seems simple. It can be more convoluted. And so when you look at rental income exclusion, it specifically applies to real estate, rental income from real estate. That's the first step that you're looking at. So you've got some facilities, you're going to rent them out to someone. If that's all you're doing, they're paying you money, they're using that facility, that real estate, and you're doing nothing else for them, you've got a rental income exclusion. So even if you're regularly carrying it on, it's a business and all those other criteria, you're not going to have to deal with unrelated business income tax with that activity. What clouds it is if you provide any services. So this would come into play if you're doing camps, for example, and you're having people come on your campus. You could just simply be renting your facilities. Here's the key: clean up when you leave. You're renting real estate. If you start providing services that over and above just general services, you're actually providing services to that organization that's renting your facility, it's no longer a rental income exclusion because it's not pure rental income from real estate. So that's one to be careful about. So creative minds in here can figure out how to get around that. If you have that situation, you might want to do multiple contracts, something to try to get some of that out, because if there's any services, you've tainted the entire agreement, unless it's just incidental services. So maybe you do 2 contracts. Okay, here's the rental of our facility. That's rental real estate, we're done. Here's a different contract if you want to sign it separately that will provide some services to you. Maybe that's a way to get around that. The other one is personal property. If you have a situation where any personal property is involved, the rules, they're not complicated, but it's a tiered deal. If you're under 10% of the total is related to personal property, you can ignore the personal property, it's real estate exclusion, and you're good to go. If it's between 10 and 50, you've got to prorate it. Whatever portions related to personal property is not excluded. What's related to real property is excluded. If it's over 50% personal property, the whole thing is tainted. You can't use the rental income exclusion. So you may have some UBIT that you have to deal with. So again, you may have multiple contracts, some way to try to separate that out to not taint the entire arrangement because you're providing some of these other services. And then finally, as you can tell, I'm trying to leave more time for Beth because she's got the gritty stuff that's going to help you guys save some money. So I'm trying to give her plenty of time here. One thing that we do see more and more and more that creates unrelated business income is partnership interests. And this can be a confusing one because you get K1s and you've got the front page of the K1. Any normal taxable entity is just simply going to take that, put it in their tax return. That's our share of income, and they roll on. If you're a tax exempt org, you have to go back into the footnotes attached to that K1. And there'll be somewhere a section that says, of the information we've given you on that page 1 of the K1, these are the amounts that are subject to unrelated business income. Those are the amounts that you would pick up in your tax return, your 990T, potentially as unrelated business income. Again, there's more to it than just that. There are usually 2 columns in there. And the 2 columns, one will say you're a qualified organization under 514C9. Now, who can quote that for me? That should have been a polling question. Should have done that. Basically, 514C9 has to do with acquisition indebtedness. And then specifically getting down to C9, it says what is not considered acquisition indebtedness. And one of the things that is not considered acquisition indebtedness with some limitations are educational organizations. So what does that mean? If you're a qualified educational organization, you don't have to worry about the debt finance rules. Because most not-for-profits, if you have property that otherwise would have been fine, but it's fine debt finance property, you may have unrelated business income. If you're an educational organization, you can skirt around that. So you'll usually see 2 columns. If you're a qualified organization under that, the educational organizations in the room would be able to say, typically, again, there are some exceptions, typically would be able to say, I'm a qualified org, I use that column. There's a second column that says you're not a qualified org, now you use this column. Either event, those are the amounts you're going to put on your 990T and consider unrelated business income. And then finally related to that, And this one I know I'm gonna, first I should have asked, does anyone have anything that would hurt projectiles if they threw them at me? Because I don't want to get hurt. If it's just paper, I can avoid that and those types of things. But is the state rules, multi-state. Sometimes we breeze right past that and don't look at it, but the reality is, if you look at those K1s, those of you don't have to do a show of hands, but I know a number of you are in the Richmond Fund, the Spider Fund. And when you look at that K1, there's a huge section about state taxes. And they list all the different states throughout the nation and say, here's the income coming from those states. Technically, theoretically, you would say, okay, well, I need to look at the rules for each of those states. And do I have to file in each of these states? I will tell you, we have some clients that have opted to file in 20 some states related to that K1 that they're getting. We have other clients that have opted, I'm filing in my home state, and if I need to try to justify it, I'll deal with it then. Obviously, we can advise each client to make their choice about what they want to do, because the reality is, for the most part, you end up filing those states and you have $100 you have to pay, $200 you have to pay, and it's a lot of time that gets spent on that to get to those small dollars. So anyway, that's a choice that you make, but just know and be aware of that. When you get those K1s, look at the details of those disclosures and make sure there aren't some other filing requirements. The last filing requirement that sometimes slides in there is what's called a Form 926. It's related to foreign property. Sometimes you're under the amounts that would require it, but if you see that blurb, slow down and look at it, get your tax folks to take a look at it, because there could be some filing requirements where you have to file some other forms with the IRS, and it has to do with transfers of property on an international level. So that was a very high level kind of refresher reminder of unrelated business income. And now I want to turn it over to Beth, who will actually talk about some stuff that's going to save you some money, possibly, right? Yeah. Yeah. There you go.
Housekeeping, I'm technologically incompetent. So if this does not, Alexa knows this, if this doesn't work right, it doesn't work right, forgive me. I'm Beth Schulhoff, and I am a tax credit specialist at Brown Edwards. I need to turn this on. I warned you ahead of time. Okay, we're gonna do it this way. All that means is all I work on is historic rehabilitation tax credits and a few other financial incentives that are available through the state. So, but probably 90% of my time is involved in shaping the future through the past. One of our partners, Chris Banta, came up with that line, and it's very, very appropriate. What I hope to do today is just to whet your appetite, give you some examples and some stories, and a tiny little bit of soap opera that I've lived through the past 20 years. I had to laugh when Dr. Bushman was talking about fathers making comments, because I went to Mary Baldwin and I graduated in the dark ages and was an English major. And I got the line of, what are you going to do with this? Well, who would have thought that I've spent 20 years crunching numbers for historic tax credit projects. I really wanted to major in art history, and that was just like a, no, you cannot do that. So this has been just a wonderful combination of going back to school in accounting, learning some of the ropes, and ending up with something that really does mix all my loves. So I'd like to encourage you to interrupt with any questions. So if we're limited in time, perhaps the whole audience can benefit from your questions. But let's get on with some of the stories. This slide here is the Lorton Reformatory Penitentiary and Workhouse. This was a project that we did years ago. I initially got involved in it as the Workhouse project. And the original buildings, and we've got the original buildings there. There were three components to the Lorton prison, if you will, which was the DC prison, and they shipped all the inmates down to Virginia. But there were three components: the penitentiary for those really, really bad folks, the reformatory for those that could be reformed. And then the workhouse. The workhouse was essentially rehabbed into an art center. And this is what it is. Whoops. Come on, Beth. See, I told you. That is what it is today. It's art studios for all different kinds of artists. And we did it as a phased project, which we'll get into more of the details of that later. But I thought that this is something that everybody sees as they drive by on 95, that you might be familiar with the name. And then the other two, the reformatory and the penitentiary, were both rehabbed by private developers. And I personally worked on the reformatory portion with a developer out of Madison, Wisconsin. And it is now housing there, as well as some mixed-use commercial buildings. Let's see. So there is Lorton. There was Lorton. Some of the topics I'd like to cover today is basically what are the rewards of doing this, because there might be some angst in the process. The application process and logistics. And throughout, I'd like to give you some examples, and probably here's where the whet the appetite comes in, of projects that I have worked on personally, and some of the interesting little caveats about them. I think all through it, you'll notice how you can help your management and staff, and how Brown Edwards can help you. And I'd like to tie in on what the two gentlemen from Tryon had just mentioned. Get your advisors in early. We are really able to help you refine the process, take some of the fear out of the process. Everyone initially thinks, oh my God, they're not going to let me paint my building pink. But that's not it at all. It's really how to put all of the pieces together for the best outcome with the least angst. Poll question number one, are there old historic buildings on your campus? Very simple, yes or no. Yeah, I could help the 77%, 79% of you. And if not, there might be buildings around your campus that might be old, and we'll see that story in just a minute. Talk about building these old buildings and giving them a new life. And if any of you would like to share some examples, I would be really appreciative. But one of the main questions I always get is, how am I going to pay for these improvements? So let me share one of my examples first. And it's not a higher education building, but it is a school. This was an old surplus building that was owned by the city of Richmond that was converted and rehabbed into Virginia's first elementary charter school, called the Patrick Henry School for Science and Arts. And it was a long time coming. It was a lot of sweat equity on the part of some very determined women to get all different kinds of fundraising. I mean, it was amazing what these ladies did. But they basically, this is before the rehab. So you can see that there are broken windows. It was in a really pitiful state. But what we did on the first round of credits was to actually do the first floor of the building, so they really could accept a certain number of students. The next phase was the second floor that I was involved in. Now, the building was sealed in the first phase. I should have prefaced it with that. Roof work, structural work, the windows, all of that was repaired. But classes were essentially housed on the first two floors. So if there are any schools that are interested in providing educational opportunities at a younger level, and there's a building nearby that's vacant, think about this. And charter schools are coming back into the forefront, at least I hope so. It's very, very successful, and it's a very interesting process to be admitted to. This is the second example I'd like to give you, and it was done by a private developer in Richmond near VCU. That is not the Patrick Henry School of Arts and Sciences. This is a building on West Franklin Street in Richmond. And I think you could tell right here that there's plants growing out of it. It was basically condemned. It was originally, in its heyday of West Franklin Street, which was then the place to live in Richmond, a single family home. And then years later, it was converted to a medical office building on the first floor and apartments up above. And then it was vacant. And then it was vacant some more. And then it was vacant some more. And one interested soul decided he needed to buy it and turned it into 18 apartments. So the ground floor, which you really can't see from here, but the ground floor and the first floor were essentially merged into 2-story apartments. And the second and third floors were 1-story apartments. And the third floor, I think it was the third, was bumped out. And keep this in mind, there was an addition to this building. The goal, obviously, was to create student housing. Okay, come on, Beth. Oh. Here's the building today. It's no longer condemned. It's been successfully approved, but this is roughly how the numbers worked. The total rehabilitation costs, and we'll get into the definition of that, were about $1.1 million. And there were some unqualified costs, and that they amounted to about $50,000. And those are things like site work that was done outside, a little bit of paving. Most of it was appliances in the various apartments. The cost of the addition from the third floor, additions are not qualified, so we had to take those numbers out, resulting in the magic number that's known as qualified rehabilitation expenditures. That's what you'll see of about $880,000. The Virginia tax credit percentage is 25%. So this project resulted in a Virginia tax credit of approximately $220,000. And that's an income tax reduction from the bottom line of what the entity owed. So that's the way it's calculated. This particular building also got a federal credit. I have purposely not mentioned the federal credit because not-for-profit entities are really not eligible to get it. You have to go through hoops and big hoops, and they're all sorts of disqualifiers along the way. So basically, if you even think about it, you might be spending all your legal fees, you might be spending all your proceeds in legal fees. So we always really advise our clients, with the advice of their attorney, just think about the state credits. So this was, again, a private developer near VCU. Back to Lorton. Again, this is a before picture, before anything was started, but here are just some of the basics. Number one, the program is administered through the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and the Department of Taxation. All your applications, we'll get into the logistics, go through the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, which I will probably be calling DHR. The architectural aspects of any one of these projects, no matter where they are guided by the Department of Interior's Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. When we talk about teams, there is a team member that will keep you guided in this direction, and I've got some stories about when those deals are not followed. Again, the Virginia credit is calculated at 25% of qualified cost. So what are those qualified costs? They're virtually all of your hard costs of construction. So it's everything like the demolition on down through masonry repair, window repair. Those are the two that you have to key in on and be very careful, because they are the two issues, and have been for ages, that tend to get the architectural reviewers really in a pickle. All of your systems, your HVAC, mechanical, plumbing, electrical, anything you do carpentry-wise, whether it's the fine carpentry or putting up some framing, all of that. All of that is included, as well as soft costs. Soft costs would include your professional fees for your architects, for your engineer, for our fee, for your historic consultants, If you take out a loan, the interest on the construction portion of the loan, the closing cost on that construction portion of the loan, all of that can be incorporated into it. And as you will see with some of the stories later, we found lots of little ways to increase that number, because remember, that's the number that you want to maximize. And we did at Lorton and a lot of other places. Okay, Beth, come on. Do we need batteries? There we go. This is another picture of Lorton after, and it is the workhouse. When I was doing the research for this, it was really kind of fun. I found, doing a Google search, an article, I think in the Washingtonian magazine, that was an interview with a former inmate of this and all of his comments of what it looked like now. And he has completely rehabilitated his life, but had memories of this. And it was so interesting to see, because one of the things he most remembered was the site work, which is one of the things that is not eligible. And we're going to work from the bottom up, but use this as an example. Costs that are not qualified, site work for sure, but I'm going to show you how we did it here. Costs related to purchase, you might not be purchasing a new building, but I did want to mention that. We've discussed additions and enlargements and appliances. The one that I'd like to point out is the next one down. If you have any state funds, we cannot use any of the costs that are paid for with those state funds toward qualified expenses. So when I mentioned getting in early, this is one of the questions that I will ask you. Is there any public funding, and where does it come from? And if it's federal funds that are funneled through the state, I don't know if those ICE-T transportation grants are available anymore, but I ran into years ago where a client had received a substantial portion of federal money through that ICE-T program, but it had funneled through VDOT. So because it was indirectly an obligation of the Commonwealth of Virginia, they lost out on getting credits with that, and it was a qualified expense. So if we get in there early, we can help you target those public funds toward costs that are not qualified if it fits within the grant restrictions in order to maximize the credits. But I wanted to really talk about site work here, because we were able to get a lot of site work at the Lorton Arts Center qualified, because there was virtually nothing there. They did not have any sewer, water, much less anything with regard to electrical and anything regard to cabling for modern internet connection. I mean, nothing. So what they had to do was go back and really do a site survey, historical site survey, and then do plans of where they were going to lay all those lines. But we were able to get credit for all of that. And it was the first time that it had been done. So they were able to get several $1 million worth of additional qualified costs because of that extra research that was done in order to bring these buildings up to code. So, and that's an important point to remember, is that no matter what, the buildings have to be up to current building code. So we were able to bring a lot of extra costs that had not been planned on toward qualified. Next question, this ought to be an easy one. Is it possible to consider aspects of site work toward costs qualified for historic rehabilitation credit? Yes or no? Yep, you're right. It is. Again, I'd like to point out that that is something that we can work with early on in the project, really get the details of what you need and try to work those in. This is the Brand Center at VCU. We had mentioned earlier that additions were not qualified. Well, this is an addition that certain portions of it were qualified. You are looking at the back of the building. The addition is on the back, and the building was originally the livery stable for the Jefferson Hotel. So it basically had no structural integrity. It had 4 brick walls. There was nothing on the inside that really held it up. And there was kind of a very, very early type of elevator. Basically, it was a wooden floor that would lift the horses up. So when VCU made plans to turn the building into their nationally renowned advertising school, we had a problem on our hands because they hired an architect from California who was quite colorful, and he was very much involved with architectural and advertising combinations. So he did not know that much about tax credits. I'll just give you that hint. Especially in Virginia, like the land of old buildings. And this guy from California comes in and it's like, oh my God, what do we do? So they did hire also a local architect to advise on this. So, and you're over on the far right, that is the livery stable. We needed this addition basically to provide structural integrity to the building. It is keeping it vertical. I wish I had a picture of the interior, but in all honesty, I was very careful with the pictures that I selected that were in the public domain. On the ground floor, there is a large conference room with a whole lot of concrete tables, and that's in the old building. And then upstairs, there's a classroom, and it's kind of got a tent in it so they can make it into smaller classrooms, but it's very much a small classroom conference center similar to this. But instead of having seats, you kind of just got the risers. And it was very, very interesting format. But most of the work was done down on that bottom floor. Well, structural integrity was one thing. They also had no systems in the building, no MEP, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, zero, nothing. And the building obviously could not meet ADA compliance, again, code required. So all of that is housed in this addition, and it's extremely modern. And what the Department of Historic Resources is looking for is something like this that cannot be confused with a historic building. And I don't think anyone would do that at all. Again, the Brand Center continues to be nationally renowned and very, very much a part of the VCU community. You apply for this thing? Well, the first question to ask is the building on a historic register? Is it individually listed, or is it within a historic district? I'm going to pick on one of my friends from Hampton, Sydney. They just had their whole campus listed as a historic district. But this is how you find out, or you can just call me. And my contact information is at the end. But basically, to research your answer, you go to the DHR website, look for the historic register, then there's a tab for nominations, then you pick your locality, and he would kill me if I gave out his name, but Chris Novelli at the Department of Historic Resources can help you. I do have his boss's permission to have given out his name. So Chris is really the first contact at the Department of Historic Resources if you really want to get the government side of it. And also on that website is a copy of all of the applications, some samples, all of that, but we'll get into more of that when we go with the team. Build your team. Everybody's talking about building a team, and this is kind of who to hire and why. Your historic consultant is going to prepare your historic component application to the Department of Historic Resources. Your architect is going to prepare the plans and specs that go along with that application. You really want a contractor that knows what he's doing, and this picture will tell you why. CPA that's fluent in the rules, and if you decide to syndicate, which is kind of the word for monetizing or selling these things, you want an attorney that knows what they're doing and has done lots and lots of these because it's tough. But the former Booker T. Washington School was transformed into senior apartments. And it is in Jackson Ward in Richmond. And some of you that have gone to older school buildings may remember that the trim around a chalkboard and the trim around the halls and the corridors were usually stained. Well, their contractor held himself out to be experienced, but maybe not. He did not really pay much attention to the application that described the plan of rehabilitation. And instead of staining all of this trim, he painted it. Well, that was not a good thing. And the architect changed midstream. The first architect had moved out of town. The developer hired a different architect who did not monitor the project adequately. And so it was sent into the Department of Historic Resources with this painted woodwork. Okay, so we send in the cost certification, which is what I do, which is basically the audit of the construction. And they send in the application saying that all the work has been done. Yikes is the answer. Turns out that the investor, the folks that are going to monetize the credits, turned out to be a client of the accounting firm that merged into where I was working. Well, we're not going to fund this thing until it's approved. Well, it's not approved because of this painted woodwork. Do you have any idea how long it took to scrape that paint off and put the trim back up? Just polished, shined, year and a half. That they were out there in limbo with, is it done yet, Beth? Well, no, I'm really sorry, it's not. Is it done yet? No. And interestingly, at some point, again, it was, they were applying for a federal credit. The federal reviewer came to Richmond and visited it, and it was, oh my God, no way. So this was just a long time in coming over something that could have easily been fixed really quickly if they'd had the right team doing the right thing all along. So that's just a note of caution. Keep talking about hiring a historic consultant to do your application. This is what the application entails. There's part one, which basically is, tell me the significance of the building. Why is it important? Who lived there? Did George Washington spend the night there? Was it built by a very prestigious architect? There are lots of reasons. Part two, most important part, you're going to describe the current, you aren't, your consultant will. Describe the current physical state of each component of the building. And usually what they'll do is they'll go through with each exterior elevation, talk about the windows, talk about the doors, talk about the roofs, talk about every little detail on the exterior, do the same thing on the interior, and then follow that up with the plan of rehabilitation, coupled with the actual plans and specs from the architect, tripled with photos of the existing building. So it's quite an undertaking in some of these larger buildings. There are capabilities of changing your plans. These are old buildings. You never know what you're going to find once you get into it. So then there's an amendment. And again, your consultant would help with that. There are, again, samples on the Department of Historic Resources website, and I would encourage you to hire an experienced consultant to get you through all of this paperwork. And there are some really great folks out there that do it. Part three also contains what I do, which is a cost certification report. And it is basically an audit or an agreed upon procedure report, depending on the size of the project of the construction. So what we'll do is we will look at the costs, we'll get copies of invoices, get copies of payment, and ensure that you're in compliance with all the little tricky points. But again, if you've come to us early, you'll know all of this at the end. At the end, everybody's anxious. They want their money. They don't want to have to sit there with some accountant saying, I need this invoice, I need that payment. So we're going to tell you all of that up front, so it's not a panic at the end. One of my favorite projects was Washington Lee Colonnade. The first test that we look at in doing the certification after we look at the cost is called a substantial rehabilitation test. And the state requires that the building total rehabilitation cost, total, not qualified, equal 50% of the assessed value of the building in the year before the building the new construction begins. That can be extended to 60 months with a phasing plan. I would encourage all of you to opt for phasing. It doesn't cost anything extra, gives you a much longer period of time to work with. W&L Colonnade is 5 buildings, and each building was its own phase. So we did 5 certifications. Again, your consultant can help with the architectural aspects of that. But one of the interesting things that happened with W&L is that these buildings basically had steam heat. And the heat came up through old steam lines that are at the bottom of the hill behind these buildings. So how are we going to heat and cool these buildings today? So what they decided to do was build a bunker down at the bottom of the hill and use the old historic steam lines to run all of the mechanicals up the hill and into each building. So nothing was put on the historic space or the roofs. So it's really hidden. We were able to bring in a lot of the cost of that, certainly all of the cost of the equipment and the cost to carry it up to the 5 buildings. But it was housed like in a bunker. And the top of the bunker was a green roof. This was done in the era of the green roof. So we got the equipment qualified, and now we're talking about the bunker. Okay, how much of this bunker can I count? So what we decided with the Department of Historic Resources, because it was a pretty expensive bunker, was the floor, the walls, the roof without the plants could count. What could not count was the front of the building, which was basically some very, very elaborate granite. So it was like the facing of that we couldn't count. So we really got a lot of the costs into that building, and it's such a beautiful project. Wheatbriar. Just some logistics notes. All the application packages are sent to the Department of Historic Resources. What they do when they get it is they will review the Part 2 application. They will get back to you with any issues. Hopefully you really haven't begun too much in the way of construction and everything can be massaged correctly. DHR will then review, when the project's complete, they will review the Part 3 application and then they review the costs. So those two are done independently. The normal review time for each portion of that is 30 to 45 days. So when you're working with your investor and syndicating these, we like to give them this time frame up front. One of the interesting aspects about the lovely library at Sweetbriar, they did put an addition on in the back. We were not able to count that, but the building really had ADA accessibility issues. It was accessible, but it was very trying. And these steps that you can see are very, very steep. So what they did, and I couldn't get a picture of it, was they did a wraparound ramp. So we were able to get, which is really considered site work, but ADA accessibility is really important. And there are specific provisions of that to allow, and this is in the federal guidelines, so the state has adopted the same ones. So we were able to bring in all of those costs to make the building ADA accessible. When I work with a client, this is kind of what the type of questions I ask. And usually, if it's a private client, going back to that Franklin Street project, my very first question is, how many times did you go to Lowe's or Home Depot? And that gives me a good sense of what I'm dealing with paper-wise. With you guys hiring a contractor, just tell me about the project, the type of building. Is it a dorm? Is it a classroom? Is it an activity center? What's your budget? What's the timing? Tell me about your team. Do you have an experienced architect and consultant and your contractor? I will let you know the type of information that we need to do the certification. We need the receipts. We need invoices. We need payment evidence. Do you have a general ledger? Is there a list, one list of all of the costs? You would be surprised how many don't have that. not necessarily you guys, but private developers. Like there was no, that Franklin Street, there was no list. He had to do the list and then we had to add to it once we got the real paper. Copy of that Part 2 application is going to give me a really good idea of what you did to the building and what kind of invoices I should be looking for. So if I don't see, say you put a new elevator in for ADA, but there's no invoice for it, it's like, okay, where's that invoice for the elevator? Oh, that's in the next phase. And finally, note of caution, it's much easier to get a question from me than from the Department of Historic Resources. So there will be questions, but it's only in your best interest. Next poll question, and I think it's last. What are your initial questions when considering using historic tax credits? Will the building qualify? Who do I want on my team? How much is it going to cost, or all of these questions? They're all very important. Syndication is monetizing these credits. You all most likely, unless you have those very tricky situations that were just discussed, which is like way above my pay grade, you've got the capability of monetizing these, and it's called syndication. It is not selling the credits, which is the word everybody uses, but it's a legal process where the building is put into an LLC, and there are lots of different ways of structuring this. That's why you want a really experienced attorney on this. But basically, the building is put into an LLC, the rehab is handled through that, and then the credits are awarded to that LLC and then allocated. So basically, the investor comes in as a member of that LLC, and he can be a 1%, 2%. There is no special amount that he has to do on the federal side, which you all would not be doing. They have to have the percentage of ownership interest. So the state of Virginia, you can specially allocate it, which happens all the time for a very minor percentage. And then the current market rate is about 80 cents on the dollar. We can introduce you to specific investors that might be appropriate to your particular situation. There is a very, very strong market for Virginia credits. Most of them are insurance companies that will be the actual end user. Funky thing about insurance companies is their tax return is due March 1st. So a lot of projects finish in December. Not good. So that whole project needs to be certified and approved by the Department of Historic Resources in 2 months for them to file their tax return. Never happens. Very, very scary. So, and these insurance companies that buy these, that are the members of these LLCs, cannot extend and cannot amend their returns because it's a premium tax return. So if we know that up front, we can start earlier. Back to that phasing thing, 60 months, you can cut it off in October, get everything collected, get it approved in plenty of time, make investor happy. I had one where a project did not finish, sent the investor into a complete panic. He called one of my clients who was not planning to phase his project, but was almost done. He was going to finish like in March. He had to cut off a phase in October just so this investor could meet his commitments to insurance companies. So it's kind of a revolving thing, tumble downhill. So just keep that in mind. Again, another planning question. But this is Hampton-Sydney, the project that they have done for their Fine Arts Center. And it's a lovely, lovely project, and hopefully they will be doing some more soon. And I will conclude with John Handley High School in Winchester, Virginia. This project really encapsulates everything. It was a 5-year phased project. One of the interesting tidbits about this is that during World War II, the collection from the art collection of the Corcoran Gallery was housed at Handley High School. So the first time I go up there, the contractor tells me to wear grubbies. So I go up there in grubbies, and I got to see where everything was hidden. So it was like crawling in the bowels of this building. It was really cool. And what they decided to do is along this main corridor, they have copies of all the paintings that were hidden there during World War II. But it's an incredible, incredible project to work on. And this was where I really learned a lot of the construction that has assisted me for years. Really terrific folks. They expanded right in here, come on, Beth, the art building. Okay, am I incompetent or what? Behind the main facade, they expanded the roof and did an addition of a half story to bring in more light into the art studios. Over on this side in the wing, they created a computer lab, and they put all of the cabling underneath, so they had to raise the floor. So there were issues with that, and how do we count those? Behind the building, they bumped it out a little bit. And so we had okay, we've got to take that little piece out. But the main thing that we were able to do at Handley was Handley Bowl. The architectural consultant was probably not real happy with me, because right before this, as the project was almost done, I read something about stadiums or buildings. And we were able to, there was a ton of drainage that was involved, and you can see, and what they had to do was run drainage under Handley Bowl out into that field that you see in the background. Back to what we were talking about with site work, that was about $2 million in extra costs that we were able to bring in. So that's how they funded that little bump out at the back of the building. So you just never know what you're going to find in 5 years of some of these things. But this was really cool. Like none of the actual field, because it's like an AstroTurf, or the new lanes were really funded. We were able to do a little bit of rehab over in the far right stadium complex, and then all of that drainage. But that's basically what getting your CPA and your consultants and everybody involved early on and throughout the project can be. So I think it might be time for questions. I'm sorry, 5 minutes.
You were speaking, and certainly you're in Richmond, so you're in Virginia, but are other states around us, because we've got people online that are in various states across the Southeast, do other states have something similar that these same concepts would apply?
Most states do. A lot of states do not have their own specific guidelines like Virginia does, and they follow the federal guidelines. So states outside of Virginia, it's we want to look at any specific project and go with those rules. Like for instance, I have worked in New York. They follow the federal guidelines. A lot is being done in Texas and Missouri, and they have guidelines similar to Virginia. But yes, most states have a program, but it's all different. You have any specific questions? My contact information is there. Thank you. And please feel free to give me a call anytime. And I'm